Picture this: a world where the sky burns orange at dawn, where vast oceans stretch endlessly under alien constellations, and where the very air shimmers with possibilities that would reshape everything we think we know about life itself. This was Earth, not the Earth you know, but Earth as it existed billions of years ago, when it first crossed that mysterious threshold from a hostile, molten wasteland into something that could nurture the earliest whispers of life. But what does it even mean for a planet to become habitable? The question seems simple enough, yet it opens doorways into some of the most profound mysteries our species has ever contemplated. When exactly did our world transform from a hellish furnace into a cradle capable of supporting life? What forces orchestrated this cosmic metamorphosis? And perhaps most intriguingly, what secrets from that ancient transformation still echo through our planet today, hidden in plain sight? The story begins in darkness, in a time so remote that it challenges the very limits of human imagination. We're talking about an epoch when the Earth was young, unimaginably young, and the universe itself was still finding its rhythm. This was the Hadean Aeon, named after Hades, the ancient Greek underworld, because early scientists believed this period represented Earth's closest approximation to hell itself. They weren't entirely wrong. The Hadean nightmare when Earth was hell. 4.5 billion years ago, give or take a few 100 million years, though what are a few 100 million years in the grand scheme of cosmic time? Our planet existed in a state that would make the most extreme environments on modern Earth seem like peaceful gardens. The surface was a roiling sea of molten rock, constantly bombarded by asteroids and comets in what scientists call the Late Heavy Bombardment. The sky, if you could call it that, was a toxic soup of methane, ammonia, and hydrogen sulfide. There was no oxygen to speak of, no protective ozone layer, and certainly no blue oceans reflecting sunlight back into space. Yet even in this apparent hellscape, something remarkable was happening. The very forces that made Earth seem so hostile were also laying the groundwork for what would eventually become the most biodiverse planet we know of in the universe. Every asteroid impact, every volcanic eruption, every chemical reaction in that poisonous atmosphere was part of an intricate dance that would eventually lead to the emergence of life. Consider the water. Where did it come from? This question has puzzled scientists for decades, and the answers they've uncovered read like something from an ancient creation myth. Some of Earth's water likely came from within, trapped in the minerals that formed our planet as it coalesced from the solar nebula. But much of it, perhaps most of it, arrived from the outer reaches of the solar system, delivered by countless comets and water-rich asteroids that crashed into our world during those violent early eons. Imagine standing on the surface of Hadean Earth, if such a thing were possible, and watching the sky light up night after night with the brilliant streaks of incoming celestial visitors. Each impact would have been catastrophic by modern standards, releasing energy equivalent to millions of nuclear weapons. Yet these cosmic collisions were also acts of creation, bringing not just water, but also organic compounds, the basic building blocks of life, from the far reaches of space. The atmosphere during this time was nothing like the oxygen-rich envelope that surrounds us today. Instead, it was what scientists call a reducing atmosphere, one dominated by hydrogen, methane, and other gases that would be toxic to most modern life forms. But this alien air had its own strange beauty and purpose. The lack of oxygen meant there was no ozone layer to filter out ultraviolet radiation from the sun, But it also meant that complex organic molecules could form and persist in ways that would be impossible in our current oxidizing environment. Lightning crackled constantly through this primordial atmosphere, and each bolt carried the potential for chemical magic. In laboratory experiments, scientists have shown that electrical discharges through mixtures of methane, ammonia, and hydrogen can produce amino acids, the building blocks of proteins. The famous Miller-Urey experiment of 1953 demonstrated this principle. But the real Earth of 4 billion years ago was conducting this experiment on a planetary scale, with lightning storms that dwarfed anything we see today. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of Hadean Earth was its relationship with the Moon. Our satellite was much closer then, so close that it would have appeared enormous in the sky, perhaps 3 times larger than it does today. The gravitational interaction between Earth and this nearby moon created tidal forces that were almost unimaginable. Where we might see tides that rise and fall by a few feet, Hadean Earth experienced tidal bulges that could reach hundreds of feet in height. These extreme tides had profound implications for the planet's geology and chemistry. They created vast tidal pools that would fill and empty with each lunar cycle, concentrating organic compounds and minerals in ways that could have facilitated the first chemical reactions leading toward life. Some scientists speculate that these tidal zones might have been the very crucibles where life first emerged, natural laboratories where the right combinations of chemicals could come together under just the right conditions. The Moon's proximity also affected Earth's rotation. Days were much shorter during the Hadean, perhaps only 6 to 8 hours long, which meant that the planet was spinning much faster on its axis. This rapid rotation, combined with the intense heat from the molten surface, created weather patterns unlike anything we can imagine today. Winds howled across the landscape at speeds that would make the strongest hurricanes seem like gentle breezes, carrying volcanic ash and chemical compounds around the globe in vast swirling storms. Yet even in this chaos, patterns were beginning to emerge. The first solid crust was forming as the planet slowly cooled, creating islands of stability in an ocean of molten rock. These early land masses were nothing like the continents we know today. They were small, unstable, and constantly being recycled back into the mantle by volcanic activity. But they represented something crucial, the first solid ground on which the chemistry of life could potentially take hold. The cooling process itself was a delicate balance. If Earth had been slightly closer to the Sun, it might have suffered the same fate as Venus, where a runaway greenhouse effect created surface temperatures hot enough to melt lead. If it had been slightly farther away, it might have frozen solid like Mars, with any water locked away as ice. But Earth occupied what scientists call the Goldilocks zone. Not too hot, not too cold, but just right for liquid water to exist on its surface. This wasn't just a matter of distance from the Sun, though. Earth's size and composition also played crucial roles. The planet was large enough to hold onto its atmosphere through gravitational attraction, but not so large that it became a gas giant like Jupiter. It had just the right mix of elements to create a magnetic field that could deflect harmful solar radiation, and just the right amount of radioactive elements in its core to keep the interior molten and geologically active. As the Hadean eon progressed, these various factors began to work together in increasingly complex ways. The bombardment from space gradually decreased as the solar system settled into its current configuration. The surface began to cool more rapidly, allowing the first permanent bodies of liquid water to form. The atmosphere started to change as volcanic outgassing added new gases, and chemical reactions began to alter its composition. But the transition from the Hadean to the next phase of Earth's history, the Archean Eon, wasn't a sudden event. It was a gradual process that took hundreds of millions of years, and the exact moment when Earth became habitable is still a matter of scientific debate. Some researchers argue that life could have emerged as early as 4.4 billion years ago during the late Hadean. Others contend that truly stable conditions for life didn't exist until well into the Archean, around 3.8 billion years ago. What we do know is that by the end of the Hadean Eon, Earth had undergone a transformation so complete that it would have been unrecognizable to any observer who had witnessed its birth. The hellish landscape of molten rock and toxic gases had given way to something far more subtle and complex. A world where water could exist in all three phases, where chemical reactions could proceed at a pace that allowed for increasing complexity, and where the first tentative experiments in what we call life were about to begin. The Archean dawn when life first whispered. The transition into the Archean Eon roughly 4 billion years ago marked one of the most significant turning points in our planet's history. This was when Earth truly began to resemble something that could support life, though it would still have seemed utterly alien to modern eyes. The name Archean comes from the Greek word archaios, meaning ancient, and it's a fitting designation for this primordial epoch when the fundamental patterns of life on Earth were first established. Picture the world as it existed then. Vast, shallow seas stretched across much of the planet's surface, their waters a murky green-brown colour, tinted by dissolved minerals and the first primitive organisms. The continents, such as they were, consisted of small volcanic islands and protocontinents that drifted slowly across the globe. The sky was still an alien orange-pink, coloured by an atmosphere that contained virtually no oxygen, but was rich in methane, carbon dioxide and hydrogen sulfide. Yet despite its alien appearance, this was a world where life was not just possible, but actively emerging. The evidence for this lies hidden in some of the oldest rocks on Earth, formations that have survived billions of years of geological upheaval to tell us their ancient stories. In places like the Pilbara region of Western Australia and the Barberton Greenstone Belt of South Africa, scientists have discovered what they believe to be the fossilized remains of the earliest life forms, microscopic organisms that lived in the shallow seas of the Archean world. These weren't life forms as we typically imagine them. They were prokaryotes, single-celled organisms without nuclei, more similar to modern bacteria than to any plant or animal. But they represented something revolutionary. The first successful experiments in harnessing energy from the environment and using it to build and maintain complex molecular structures. They were the first entities on Earth that could truly be called alive. The question of how these first life forms emerged is one of the greatest mysteries in science, and it's a question that takes us to the very edge of what we can know about our planet's past. The fossil record from this time is sparse and difficult to interpret, partly because these early organisms were so small and simple, and partly because the rocks that might contain their remains have been subjected to billions of years of heat, pressure, and chemical alteration. But scientists have developed ingenious ways to read the chemical signatures left behind by these ancient life forms. They look for specific ratios of carbon isotopes that suggest biological activity, for unusual concentrations of sulfur compounds that might indicate the presence of sulfur-metabolizing bacteria, and for microscopic structures in ancient rocks that could be the fossilized remains of cell walls or other biological materials. One of the most intriguing pieces of evidence comes from formations called stromatolites, layered rock structures that are created by the growth and activity of microbial mats. Modern stromatolites can still be found in a few places on Earth, such as Shark Bay in Western Australia, where they're formed by cyanobacteria that trap and bind sediment as they grow. The ancient stromatolites found in Archean rocks suggest that similar microbial communities were thriving in the shallow seas of the early Earth, creating some of the first ecosystems our planet had ever seen. These early ecosystems were powered by chemosynthesis rather than photosynthesis. The organisms that built them didn't rely on sunlight for energy, as most modern life does. Instead, they extracted energy from chemical reactions involving sulfur, iron, and other elements that were abundant in the Archean environment. They lived around hydrothermal vents on the ocean floor, in hot springs, and in the chemical-rich waters of shallow seas. The hydrothermal vents of the Archean Ocean were particularly important as potential cradles of life. These underwater geysers, where superheated water rich in dissolved minerals erupted from the seafloor, created unique chemical environments that could have facilitated the formation of complex organic molecules. The temperature gradients around these vents, from scalding hot at the source to merely warm a few feet away, provided a range of conditions that could support different types of chemical reactions. Some scientists have proposed that life itself might have originated at these hydrothermal vents, in a process that began with simple chemical reactions and gradually evolved into the complex biochemistry we associate with living organisms. The iron-sulfur world hypothesis, developed by chemist Günther Wächtershäuser, suggests that life began with the formation of organic compounds on the surfaces of iron-sulfur minerals found around these vents. But hydrothermal vents weren't the only potential birthplaces for life. The tidal pools created by the extreme tides of the early Earth would have provided another type of natural laboratory, where organic compounds could become concentrated and undergo repeated cycles of wetting and drying that might have facilitated the formation of more complex molecules. The clay minerals found in these environments could have acted as templates or catalysts for the assembly of the first primitive genetic materials. The genetic material of these early life forms was almost certainly RNA rather than DNA. RNA is simpler than DNA and can act both as a storage medium for genetic information and as a catalyst for chemical reactions. This has led to the RNA world hypothesis, which suggests that there was a period in Earth's early history when life was based entirely on RNA, before the evolution of the more stable DNA and the more efficient protein enzymes that characterize modern life. The RNA world would have been a strange place indeed. Without the sophisticated error correction mechanisms that modern organisms use to maintain the integrity of their genetic information, early RNA-based life forms would have been subject to rapid mutation and evolution. This might seem like a disadvantage, but it could actually have been crucial for the early evolution of life, allowing rapid experimentation with different biochemical strategies and the quick adaptation to changing environmental conditions. As these early life forms evolved and diversified, they began to have a profound impact on their environment. The most significant change was the gradual alteration of the ocean's chemistry. Early organisms that metabolize sulfur compounds began to remove hydrogen sulfide from the water, while others that processed iron compounds affected the distribution of dissolved metals. These changes created new ecological niches that could be exploited by different types of organisms, leading to increasing biological diversity. But perhaps the most important development during the Archean was the evolution of photosynthesis. This didn't happen all at once. It was a gradual process that probably began with simple light harvesting systems that could supplement the energy obtained from chemical reactions. The first photosynthetic organisms probably used hydrogen sulfide or organic compounds as electron donors rather than water, and they didn't produce oxygen as a byproduct. The evolution of oxygenic photosynthesis, the type that uses water as an electron donor and produces oxygen as a waste product, was still in the future during most of the Archean. But when it did evolve, probably toward the end of the Archean eon around 2.7 billion years ago, it would set the stage for one of the most dramatic transformations in Earth's history. The organisms responsible for this revolution were cyanobacteria, also known as blue-green algae. These remarkable microorganisms developed the ability to harness sunlight to split water molecules, using the hydrogen to build organic compounds and releasing the oxygen as waste. At first, this oxygen was quickly absorbed by dissolved iron in the oceans, forming iron oxide minerals that settled to the sea floor. But eventually, the oxygen-producing capacity of the cyanobacteria would overwhelm these natural sinks, leading to a dramatic increase in atmospheric oxygen levels. This transformation didn't happen overnight. The buildup of oxygen in the atmosphere was a gradual process that took hundreds of millions of years. But its effects would be profound and irreversible, setting the stage for the next great chapter in Earth's history and the evolution of more complex forms of life. The Archean world was also shaped by geological processes that were quite different from those operating today. The Earth's interior was much hotter than it is now, which meant that volcanic activity was more intense and widespread. The continents were smaller and less stable, constantly being recycled back into the mantle through processes that operated much more rapidly than modern plate tectonics. This geological activity had important implications for the chemistry of the oceans and atmosphere. Volcanic outgassing continuously added new gases to the atmosphere, while the weathering of volcanic rocks provided essential nutrients for early life forms. The rapid recycling of crustal material also meant that the chemical composition of the oceans was constantly changing, creating a dynamic environment that may have spurred the evolution of increasingly sophisticated biochemical systems. The climate of the Archean world was also quite different from today's. Despite the fact that the sun was about 25% dimmer than it is now, a puzzle known as the faint young sun paradox, the Earth's surface was kept warm by a thick atmosphere rich in greenhouse gases like methane and carbon dioxide. This created a global climate that was probably warmer and more humid than today's, with no ice caps at the poles and tropical conditions extending to high latitudes. But this warm climate was also unstable. The methane that helped keep the planet warm was constantly being broken down by ultraviolet radiation from the sun, and it had to be continuously replenished by biological and geological processes. This created a delicate balance that could be easily disrupted by changes in volcanic activity, biological productivity, or other factors. As the Archean eon progressed, this balance began to shift. The evolution of oxygenic photosynthesis introduced a new factor into the equation: oxygen, which reacts with methane to form carbon dioxide and water. As oxygen levels in the atmosphere began to rise, methane levels began to fall, setting the stage for a dramatic climate change that would mark the end of the Archean and the beginning of the next phase of Earth's history. The Great Oxidation, when Earth learned to breathe. Around 2.4 billion years ago, Earth experienced what may have been the most dramatic environmental catastrophe and transformation in its entire history. Scientists call it the Great Oxidation event, but that clinical name barely captures the magnitude of what occurred. This was nothing less than a complete restructuring of our planet's atmosphere, oceans, and the very nature of life itself. It was a revolution that would have seemed like the end of the world to the organisms that had dominated Earth for over 1 billion years, yet it paved the way for the complex oxygen-breathing life forms that would eventually include us. To understand the significance of this event, we need to imagine what Earth was like before it happened. For nearly 2 billion years, our planet had been dominated by anaerobic organisms, life forms that not only didn't need oxygen, but were actually poisoned by it. These ancient microbes had created a stable, if alien, world where the atmosphere contained virtually no free oxygen, where the oceans were rich in dissolved iron and sulfur compounds, and where life existed in a delicate balance with the chemical cycles of the planet. Then came the cyanobacteria, those remarkable organisms that had learned to harness the power of sunlight to split water molecules and build organic compounds. At first their impact was subtle. The oxygen they produced as a waste product was quickly absorbed by the iron dissolved in the oceans, forming iron oxide minerals that settled to the seafloor in distinctive layers that geologists call banded iron formations. These geological structures, found in rocks around the world, tell the story of this ancient chemical battle between oxygen-producing life and an oxygen-hungry planet. For hundreds of millions of years this process continued. The cyanobacteria multiplied and spread, forming vast microbial mats in shallow seas and coastal environments. They built elaborate stromatolite structures, creating some of the first complex ecosystems on Earth. And all the while they were pumping oxygen into the oceans and atmosphere at an ever-increasing rate. But the planet's capacity to absorb this oxygen wasn't infinite. The dissolved iron in the oceans was gradually being used up, converted into iron oxide minerals and removed from the water. Volcanic gases that could react with oxygen were being overwhelmed by the sheer volume of oxygen production. And slowly, inexorably, free oxygen began to accumulate in the atmosphere. The consequences were catastrophic for the existing life forms. Oxygen is a highly reactive gas. It's what makes fire possible, what causes metals to rust, what breaks down organic compounds. For organisms that had evolved in an oxygen-free world, the rising levels of atmospheric oxygen were literally toxic. Many species went extinct, unable to adapt to the new chemical environment. It was, in effect, the first mass extinction event in Earth's history, caused not by an asteroid impact or volcanic eruption, but by the waste products of life itself. But extinction wasn't the only outcome. Some organisms found ways to not just survive in the new oxygen-rich environment, but to thrive in it. They developed biochemical mechanisms to neutralize the harmful effects of oxygen, and eventually some learned to use oxygen as a source of energy for their metabolic processes. This was the birth of aerobic respiration, the process that powers most complex life on Earth today. The advantages of aerobic respiration were enormous. Oxygen-based metabolism is far more efficient than the anaerobic processes that had dominated the Archean world, where anaerobic organisms might extract 2 molecules of ATP, the universal energy currency of life, from a molecule of glucose. Aerobic organisms could extract 38. This dramatic increase in energy efficiency opened up entirely new possibilities for life. With more energy available, organisms could afford to build more complex cellular structures. They could invest energy in mobility, allowing them to actively seek out food and favorable environments rather than simply waiting for nutrients to drift by. They could develop more sophisticated sensory systems to detect changes in their environment. And perhaps most importantly, they could begin to experiment with multicellularity, the cooperation between individual cells that would eventually lead to the evolution of plants, animals, and fungi. But the Great Oxidation Event didn't just affect life, it transformed the entire planet. The new oxygen-rich atmosphere created an ozone layer that filtered out harmful ultraviolet radiation from the sun, making the surface of the land more hospitable to life. The chemical composition of the oceans changed dramatically as oxygen reacted with dissolved metals and other compounds. Even the climate was affected, as the methane that had helped keep the planet warm was oxidized and removed from the atmosphere. This climate change was particularly dramatic. The loss of methane, combined with other factors, led to a period of global cooling that some scientists call snowball Earth, a time when ice may have covered the planet from the poles to the equator. This Paleoproterozoic glaciation lasted for hundreds of millions of years and represented one of the most severe climate changes in Earth's history. Yet even this apparent catastrophe may have played a crucial role in the evolution of life. The harsh conditions of snowball Earth would have created intense selective pressure, favouring organisms that could survive in extreme environments. The cycling between frozen and unfrozen conditions as the ice ages came and went would have created new ecological niches and opportunities for evolutionary innovation. The evidence for the Great Oxidation Event is written in the rocks themselves, in chemical signatures that tell the story of this ancient transformation. The banded iron formations that had been deposited for billions of years suddenly stopped forming around 2.4 billion years ago, indicating that the dissolved iron in the oceans had been exhausted. Red beds, sedimentary rocks coloured by iron oxide, began to appear for the first time, showing that oxygen was now present in the atmosphere in sufficient quantities to rust iron on land. Perhaps most tellingly, the isotopic composition of sulfur in rocks changed dramatically at this time. Before the Great Oxidation Event, sulfur isotopes show a pattern that indicates they were processed in an oxygen-free atmosphere. After the event, this pattern disappears, replaced by the isotopic signatures we see in today's oxygen-rich world. The transformation wasn't uniform across the planet. Different regions experienced the effects of rising oxygen levels at different times and to different degrees. Some environments, particularly deep ocean basins and sediments, remained oxygen-free for hundreds of millions of years after the atmosphere became oxygenated. This created a patchwork world where aerobic and anaerobic organisms coexisted in different ecological niches. This environmental heterogeneity may have been crucial for the continued evolution of life. The persistence of oxygen-free environments meant that anaerobic organisms didn't go completely extinct. Many lineages survived and continued to evolve, eventually giving rise to the diverse communities of anaerobic microbes that still play crucial roles in modern ecosystems. At the same time, the new oxygen-rich environments provided opportunities for the evolution of aerobic organisms and the development of increasingly complex forms of life. The Great Oxidation Event also had profound effects on the geological processes operating on Earth. The presence of oxygen in the atmosphere and oceans changed the way rocks weathered and eroded. New types of minerals formed that couldn't exist in an oxygen-free environment. The cycling of elements like carbon, nitrogen, and sulfur was fundamentally altered as oxygen became a major player in these biogeochemical cycles. One of the most significant changes was in the carbon cycle. Before the Great Oxidation Event, carbon was cycled primarily through anaerobic processes involving methane and other reduced carbon compounds. After the event, oxygen-based processes became dominant, leading to the formation of new types of organic compounds and changes in the way carbon was stored in rocks and sediments. These changes in the carbon cycle had important implications for climate. The burial of organic carbon in sediments removes carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, leading to cooling, while the oxidation of organic matter releases carbon dioxide, leading to warming. The new oxygen-rich world created new pathways for these processes, contributing to the complex climate dynamics that would characterize the rest of Earth's history. The Great Oxidation Event also marked the beginning of a new phase in the evolution of Earth's magnetic field. The chemical changes in the planet's interior caused by the new oxygen-rich environment affected the generation of the magnetic field, leading to changes in its strength and stability. This had important implications for the protection of the atmosphere from solar wind and cosmic radiation. As the immediate effects of the Great Oxidation Event began to stabilize, Earth entered a new phase of its history. The Paleoproterozoic era, which followed the Archean, was characterized by the gradual establishment of the oxygen-rich world we know today. But this wasn't a simple, linear progression. There were setbacks and reversals, periods when oxygen levels dropped and anaerobic conditions returned to parts of the planet. One of the most significant of these reversals occurred around 2.0 billion years ago, in an event that some scientists call the Loma-Gundi event. During this time, there was a massive burial of organic carbon in sediments, which removed carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and led to a dramatic increase in oxygen levels, possibly to concentrations even higher than today's. This was followed by a period of instability and eventual decline in oxygen levels, creating a complex pattern of environmental change that would continue for hundreds of millions of years. These fluctuations in oxygen levels had important effects on the evolution of life. Periods of high oxygen concentration favored the evolution of larger, more complex organisms, while periods of low oxygen concentration created selective pressure for efficiency and the ability to survive in oxygen-poor environments. This dynamic environment may have been crucial for driving the evolutionary innovations that would eventually lead to the emergence of eukaryotic cells, cells with nuclei and other complex internal structures. The story of the Great Oxidation Event is ultimately a story about the power of life to transform its environment. The cyanobacteria that triggered this event were tiny, simple organisms, yet their collective activity was powerful enough to change the entire planet. They demonstrate that life is not just a passive passenger on Earth, but an active force that shapes the conditions under which it exists. This principle, that life and environment are intimately connected and constantly influencing each other, would become even more important as Earth's history progressed. The oxygen-rich world created by the Great Oxidation Event set the stage for the next great chapter in the story of life. The evolution of complex cells, multicellular organisms, and eventually the explosion of biodiversity that would transform Earth into the vibrant, life-filled planet we know today. The Proterozoic puzzle, life's long apprenticeship. Following the dramatic upheaval of the Great Oxidation Event, Earth entered what might be called its longest and most mysterious chapter, the Proterozoic Eon. Stretching from about 2.5 billion years ago to roughly 540 million years ago, this vast expanse of time, nearly 2 billion years, represents more than 40% of Earth's entire history. Yet for much of the 20th century, scientists knew remarkably little about what happened during these eons. They called it the Boring Billion, assuming it was a period of relative stagnation when not much of evolutionary significance occurred. How wrong they were. As our tools for reading the ancient record have become more sophisticated, the Proterozoic has revealed itself to be anything but boring. It was during this time that some of the most fundamental innovations in the history of life occurred. Innovations so profound that they made possible everything that would follow, from the first animals to the complex ecosystems of today. The early Proterozoic world would still have seemed alien to modern eyes, but it was beginning to show hints of the planet we know. The atmosphere now contained significant amounts of oxygen, though levels fluctuated dramatically over time. The oceans were clearer than they had been during the Archean, no longer clouded by dissolved iron, but they were still quite different chemically from modern seawater. The continents were larger and more stable, though they were arranged in configurations that would be unrecognisable today. But perhaps the most significant difference was in the nature of life itself. The Proterozoic was when life began its long journey from simple, single-celled organisms to the complex multicellular forms that would eventually dominate the planet. This wasn't a sudden transformation. It was a gradual process that took over 1 billion years and involved some of the most remarkable evolutionary innovations in Earth's history. The first and perhaps most important of these innovations was the evolution of eukaryotic cells, cells with nuclei and other complex internal structures. Modern eukaryotes include all plants, animals, fungi, and many single-celled organisms, but their origins lie deep in the Proterozoic past. The evolution of eukaryotic cells was not just a matter of adding new structures to existing cells. It involved a fundamental reorganization of cellular architecture that opened up entirely new possibilities for life. The story of how eukaryotic cells evolved is one of the most fascinating in all of biology, and it involves a process that seems almost too remarkable to be true: endosymbiosis. According to this theory, first proposed by biologist Lynn Margulis in the 1960s, eukaryotic cells evolved when one type of cell engulfed another, creating a permanent partnership that benefited both organisms. The evidence for this theory comes from the structure of modern eukaryotic cells. Organelles, like mitochondria and chloroplasts, have their own DNA, which is more similar to bacterial DNA than to the DNA found in the cell nucleus. They reproduce independently of the cell cycle, dividing in a manner similar to bacteria. And they are surrounded by double membranes, which is exactly what you would expect if they had originated as separate organisms that were engulfed by another cell. This process of endosymbiosis probably happened multiple times during the Proterozoic. The mitochondria that power most eukaryotic cells likely originated from ancient bacteria that were specialized for aerobic respiration. The chloroplasts that allow plants to photosynthesize probably evolved from cyanobacteria that were incorporated into early eukaryotic cells. Each of these partnerships created new capabilities and opened up new ecological niches. The evolution of eukaryotic cells had profound implications for the future of life on Earth. Eukaryotic cells are generally much larger than prokaryotic cells, and their complex internal structure allows for much more sophisticated cellular processes. They can store more genetic information, carry out more complex metabolic pathways, and respond to environmental changes in more nuanced ways. But perhaps most importantly, eukaryotic cells made possible the evolution of sexual reproduction. While some prokaryotes can exchange genetic material, true sexual reproduction, involving the fusion of gametes and the recombination of genetic material from two parents, is found only in eukaryotes. Sexual reproduction dramatically accelerates the pace of evolution by creating new combinations of genes in each generation, allowing populations to adapt more quickly to changing environmental conditions. The evolution of sexual reproduction during the Proterozoic was a game-changer for life on Earth. It allowed for much more rapid evolutionary innovation and adaptation, setting the stage for the explosion of biological diversity that would characterize later periods of Earth's history. But it also introduced new complexities and challenges, as organisms had to develop mechanisms for finding mates, competing for reproductive opportunities and ensuring the survival of their offspring. As eukaryotic cells evolved and diversified during the Proterozoic, they began to experiment with new ways of living. Some remained single-celled, but others began to form colonies, groups of cells that lived together and sometimes specialized for different functions. These colonial organisms were the first steps toward true multicellularity, though the transition from colonial to truly multicellular life was gradual and complex. The evolution of multicellularity was another of the great innovations of the Proterozoic. Multicellular organisms have several advantages over single-celled ones. They can grow larger, they can specialize different parts of their bodies for different functions, and they can create more complex structures and behaviors. But multicellularity also requires sophisticated mechanisms for coordinating the activities of different cells and ensuring that they work together for the benefit of the whole organism. The first multicellular organisms were probably simple affairs, perhaps just clusters of identical cells that stuck together after dividing, but over time, these early multicellular forms evolved increasingly sophisticated ways of organizing themselves. Cells began to specialize for different functions, creating the first division of labor within organisms. Some cells became specialized for reproduction, others for obtaining nutrients, and still others for providing structure and support. Evidence for these early experiments in multicellularity comes from fossils found in rocks from the late Proterozoic. The most famous of these are the Ediacaran fossils, named after the Ediacara Hills in South Australia, where they were first discovered. These enigmatic organisms, which lived between about 600 and 540 million years ago, represent some of the earliest known multicellular life forms. The Ediacaran organisms were unlike anything alive today. They had soft bodies with no hard shells or skeletons, and they came in a bewildering variety of shapes and sizes. Some looked like discs or fronds, others like quilted mattresses or strange geometric patterns. Many were quite large. Some reached lengths of over a metre. Yet they seem to have lacked many of the features we associate with complex animals, such as mouths, guts, or obvious sensory organs. The nature and relationships of the Ediacaran organisms remain one of the great puzzles in paleontology. Some scientists think they were early animals, perhaps related to modern cnidarians like jellyfish and corals. Others argue that they represent an entirely separate experiment in multicellular life, a failed evolutionary attempt that went extinct without leaving any modern descendants. Still others suggest that the Ediacaran assemblage includes representatives of multiple different groups, some of which may be related to modern animals while others are not. What's clear is that the Ediacaran organisms represent a major milestone in the evolution of life on Earth. They show that by the end of the Proterozoic, life had evolved the ability to create large, complex, multicellular forms. They also suggest that the late Proterozoic was a time of extensive evolutionary experimentation, as life explored different ways of organizing multicellular bodies. The environmental conditions that allowed for this evolutionary experimentation were quite different from those of earlier periods. Oxygen levels in the atmosphere and oceans had stabilized at levels that could support larger, more active organisms. The climate was generally warm and stable, with no evidence for the extreme ice ages that had characterized earlier parts of the Proterozoic. The oceans were becoming more chemically similar to modern seawater, with lower concentrations of dissolved metals and other compounds that might be toxic to complex life. But the Proterozoic world was also shaped by some extreme events that would have tested the limits of life's adaptability. The first began shortly after the beginning of the Proterozoic eon, and evidence of at least 4 during the Neoproterozoic era at the end of the Proterozoic eon, possibly climaxing with the hypothesized snowball Earth of the Sturtian and Marinoan glaciations. These glaciations were not ordinary ice ages. They were periods when ice may have extended from the poles all the way to the equator, creating what scientists call snowball Earth conditions. Depending on how you count, there were 2 episodes of snowball Earth glaciation during the Neoproterozoic, or perhaps 3. They are called the Sturtian, about 720 to 660 million years ago, and the Marinoan, about 645 to 640 million years ago, with the Gaskias, or Ediacaran, at about 580 million years ago, being the possible 3rd event in the sequence. There's pretty good evidence that the Sturtian and Marinoan ice ages were true snowballs, with glaciers flowing at sea level at the equator, but the Gaskias event seems to have not been as extensive. The evidence for these extreme glaciations comes from multiple lines of geological evidence. Ancient glaciers left behind 3 kinds of signatures: 1. Striations, 2. Tillites, and 3. Dropstones. For the Sturtian, there are 39 localities documented on 6 continents. For the Marinoan glaciation, there are 48 places where glaciogenic signatures have been found. But perhaps the most compelling evidence comes from paleomagnetic studies that show these glacial deposits formed at tropical latitudes, something that would be impossible unless ice had spread across the entire planet. Paleomagnetism, the study of Earth's magnetic field over time by looking at rocks, was first used to verify the theories of continental drift and plate tectonics. However, it can also be used to support the snowball Earth hypothesis. By looking at this alignment over time, it is apparent that this magnetic field has changed. This allows paleomagnetists to estimate the latitude of a rock when it was formed. Other studies have found that rocks from late Neoproterozoic would also have been situated at low latitudes. The finding of glacial deposits at these latitudes lends evidence to support the theory of global Neoproterozoic glaciations. The causes of these extreme glaciations remain a subject of intense scientific debate. In the Neoproterozoic era, the Earth experienced 2 broad intervals of global glaciation, commonly known as snowball Earth. There was also a rapid diversification of life, with the evolution of most of the eukaryotic lineages. The proliferation of life could have led to increases in atmospheric O2 levels and concomitant decreases in CO2 and CH4. Coupled biochemical and geochemical changes would have led to global cooling and glaciation. This so-called biotic hypothesis of the snowball Earth is consistent with the most salient features of the reported evidence and explains the consecutive episodes of global glaciation. The irony is profound. Life itself may have been responsible for creating conditions that nearly extinguished it. As photosynthetic organisms proliferated during the Proterozoic, they continued to pump oxygen into the atmosphere while simultaneously removing carbon dioxide. Another consequence of the Great Oxygen Event was the reduction of the greenhouse effect as oxygen removed methane from the atmosphere. The loss of these greenhouse gases would have led to dramatic cooling, potentially triggering the runaway ice albedo feedback that created snowball Earth conditions. But how could life survive such extreme conditions? The answer lies in the remarkable resilience and adaptability that had been evolving over billions of years. Even during the most severe glaciations, life found ways to persist. It is believed that the effect of a snowball event on the biosphere of Earth would have been catastrophic. This belief is supported by evidence that indicates the carbon isotope ratios of carbonates from this period are the same as those of Earth's mantle, implying that photosynthesis and most eukaryotic life was effectively eliminated. However, Corsetti et al. Have shown that microfossils from the Neoproterozoic Kingston Peak Formation contain prokaryotes, but also eukaryotes. This evidence suggests that life was not only able to survive, but also adapted to live in shallow water carbonate environments. In addition, the fossils found are similar to those found in rocks that immediately predate the glaciation event, further suggesting life survived this event. The survival strategies were diverse and ingenious. Some organisms retreated to deep ocean environments around hydrothermal vents, where volcanic heat provided energy and warmth even when the surface was frozen. Others found refuge in coastal areas where geothermal activity kept small pockets of liquid water available. Some may have survived beneath the ice in a thin layer of liquid water at the ocean floor, sustained by nutrients seeping from the seafloor sediments. These extreme glacial periods had another crucial effect. They created intense evolutionary pressure that may have spurred the development of new survival strategies and biological innovations. The resulting extreme greenhouse conditions had a strong selective pressure on the evolution of life in the Proterozoic. Repeated snowball glaciations caused a series of genetic bottleneck and flush cycles before the advent of Ediacaran biota. The end of each Snowball Earth episode was as dramatic as its beginning. Global glaciation would lead to the shutdown of chemical weathering, permitting the build-up of volcanic CO2. Kirschvink also described how the Earth could escape from a snowball event, the greenhouse effect produced by this long-term accumulation of CO2 in the atmosphere. One proposal is that volcanic activity releases greenhouse gases that eventually warm the planet back up. The amount of carbon dioxide, CO2, needed might be several hundred times higher than what our atmosphere contains now. When the ice finally began to melt, the transition was rapid and dramatic. The highly reflective ice sheets gave way to dark ocean water, which absorbed solar energy and accelerated the warming process. The result was a period of extreme greenhouse conditions, with global temperatures potentially much higher than those of today. The snow covering melted down soon after the level of the atmospheric carbon dioxide raised about 30 times the present level. These dramatic climate swings, from extreme cold to extreme heat, created environmental conditions that were unlike anything in Earth's later history. They also set the stage for the next great chapter in the evolution of life, the emergence of truly complex multicellular organisms that would eventually give rise to the incredible diversity of the Phanerozoic eon. The Neoproterozoic Renaissance life learns complexity. As the last of the great Snowball Earth episodes ended around 635 million years ago, our planet entered what might be called its most creative period since the origin of life itself. The late Neoproterozoic, particularly the Ediacaran period, witnessed evolutionary innovations that would fundamentally reshape the nature of life on Earth. This was when life learned to build complex multicellular bodies, not just simple colonies of similar cells, but organized structures with specialized parts working together toward common goals. The world that emerged from the final Snowball Earth was remarkably different from the one that had been frozen. A second, later surge in oxygen concentrations is called the Neoproterozoic oxygenation event, occurred during the middle and late Neoproterozoic, and drove the rapid evolution of multicellular life towards the end of the era. The oceans had been thoroughly mixed and oxygenated by the global glaciations, creating new chemical conditions that could support larger, more active organisms. The climate was generally warm and stable, with no polar ice caps and greenhouse conditions that extended tropical climates to high latitudes. Perhaps most importantly, the extreme selective pressures of the Snowball Earth episodes had created evolutionary bottlenecks that forced life to develop new survival strategies. The organisms that emerged from these trials were more robust, more adaptable, and more complex than anything that had come before. The first clear evidence of this new complexity appears in the fossil record around 600 million years ago in the form of the enigmatic organisms known as the Ediacaran biota. Evidence of tiny sponge-like fossils in rocks dated to 890 million years ago suggests that the earliest metazoans, animals made up of more than one type of cell, may have emerged a little more than halfway through the Proterozoic. However, the earliest undisputed metazoans appeared much later. By 600 million to 543 million years ago, the multicellular Ediacara fauna had appeared. They required oxygen for growth and were the precursors of organisms with skeletons, the appearance of which marked the end of the Proterozoic and the beginning of the Phanerozoic eon. These Ediacaran organisms represent one of the most fascinating and controversial chapters in the history of life. They were unlike anything that exists today, soft-bodied, often large, some reaching over a metre in length, and displaying body plans that seem almost alien to our modern understanding of animal architecture. Some looked like quilted discs, others like fronds or fans, and still others resembled bizarre geometric patterns that defy easy categorization. The discovery of the Ediacaran biota revolutionized our understanding of early animal evolution. Before these fossils were recognized and properly studied, scientists believed that complex multicellular life had appeared suddenly at the beginning of the Cambrian period, around 540 million years ago. The Ediacaran fossils pushed back the origin of complex life by at least 60 million years and revealed that the Cambrian explosion was not the beginning of multicellular life, but rather the culmination of a much longer period of evolutionary experimentation. But what exactly were these Ediacaran organisms? This question has generated decades of scientific debate and continues to challenge our understanding of early animal evolution. Some scientists argue that they were early animals, perhaps related to modern cnidarians like jellyfish and sea anemones. Others contend that they represent an entirely separate experiment in multicellular organization, a failed evolutionary branch that went extinct without leaving any direct descendants in the modern world. The truth is probably more complex than either of these simple explanations. The Ediacaran biota appears to have included representatives of several different groups, some of which may indeed be related to modern animals, while others seem to represent unique evolutionary experiments that leave no living counterparts. What they all shared was the ability to organize multiple cells into coordinated structures that could grow to substantial sizes and perform specialized functions. One of the most intriguing aspects of the Ediacaran organisms is their apparent lack of obvious feeding structures. Many lacked mouths, guts, or other features that we associate with animal feeding. This has led to various hypotheses about how they obtain nutrition. Some may have absorbed dissolved organic matter directly through their body surfaces. Others may have housed symbiotic photosynthetic organisms, much like modern corals do. Still others may have fed through mechanisms that are completely unknown in modern organisms. The lack of hard parts in most Ediacaran organisms also tells us something important about the environment in which they lived. The absence of shells, spines, or other defensive structures suggests that predation pressure was relatively low during this time. This was a world before the arms race between predators and prey that would characterize later periods of Earth's history. The Ediacaran organisms lived in what might be called an Garden of Ediacara. a period of relative peace and abundance that allowed for the exploration of new body plans and ways of life. This peaceful world would not last. As the Ediacaran period drew to a close, around 540 million years ago, many of these soft-bodied organisms disappeared from the fossil record. Some may have evolved into more familiar animal forms, but many seem to have gone extinct entirely. The cause of this extinction is not entirely clear, but it may have been related to the rise of the first active predators and the beginning of the evolutionary arms race that would dominate the Phanerozoic eon. The end of the Ediacaran period was marked by several important evolutionary events, innovations that would prove crucial for the success of later animal life. The first was the evolution of biomineralization, the ability to extract minerals from seawater and incorporate them into biological structures. This innovation allowed organisms to build shells, exoskeletons, and other hard parts that could provide protection from predators and support for larger body sizes. The second major innovation was the evolution of active predation. While the Ediacaran world had been largely peaceful, the latest Neoproterozoic saw the emergence of organisms that actively hunted and consumed other organisms. This development fundamentally changed the evolutionary landscape, creating new selective pressures that would drive the rapid diversification of animal life in the following period. The third innovation was the evolution of complex nervous systems and sensory organs. While some Ediacaran organisms may have had simple sensory capabilities, the latest Neoproterozoic saw the development of more sophisticated neurological systems that could process sensory information and coordinate complex behaviors. This was crucial for the evolution of active locomotion, predation, and escape behaviors that would characterize later animal evolution. These innovations set the stage for one of the most dramatic events in the history of life, the Cambrian explosion. But before we explore that remarkable period, it's important to understand that the foundations for the explosion had been laid during the long Proterozoic apprenticeship. The basic cellular machinery of complex life, the fundamental body plans of animals, and the ecological relationships that would dominate later periods all had their origins in the quiet experiments of the Proterozoic world. The Proterozoic eon, that vast expanse of time that had once seemed so boring to scientists, had revealed itself to be the most creative and innovative period in Earth's biological history. It was during this time that life learned to harness oxygen for energy, to build complex cellular structures, to reproduce sexually, to form multicellular bodies, and to interact in complex ecological networks. All of the fundamental innovations that make modern life possible had their origins in the Proterozoic laboratories of evolution. As the Proterozoic drew to a close, Earth was poised on the brink of a new era. The stage was set, the actors were ready, and the next great drama in the story of life was about to begin. The world was about to witness an explosion of biological creativity that would transform a planet dominated by microbes and simple, soft-bodied organisms into a vibrant, diverse biosphere that would eventually include every form of life we know today, including, ultimately, us. The Cambrian Revolution life goes to war. At 541 million years ago, something extraordinary happened on Earth. After nearly 4 billion years of relatively slow experimental evolution, life suddenly exploded into a bewildering array of forms, many of them unlike anything that had existed before or has existed since. The Cambrian explosion, also known as Cambrian radiation or Cambrian diversification, is an interval of time beginning approximately 538.8 million years ago, years ago in the Cambrian period of the early Paleozoic, when a sudden radiation of complex life occurred and practically all major animal phyla started appearing in the fossil record. It lasted for about 13 to 25 million years and resulted in the divergence of most modern metazoan phyla. The event was accompanied by major diversification in other groups of organisms as well. This event, known as the Cambrian explosion, marks not just the beginning of the Phanerozoic eon, the age of visible life, but a fundamental transformation in the nature of life on Earth. Before early Cambrian diversification, most organisms were relatively simple, composed of individual cells or small multicellular organisms, occasionally organized into colonies. As the rate of diversification subsequently accelerated, the variety of life became much more complex and began to resemble that of today. Almost all present-day animal phyla appeared during this period, including the earliest chordates. What makes the Cambrian explosion so remarkable is not just the speed at which it occurred, but the nature of the innovations it produced. This was when life learned to make weapons and armor, to hunt and hide, to see and be seen. It was when the peaceful garden of Ediacara gave way to what might be called the first biological arms race, an evolutionary competition that would drive innovation at a pace never before seen in Earth's history. A lot can happen in 40 million years, the approximate length of the Cambrian period. Animals showed dramatic diversification during this period of Earth's history. This has been called the Cambrian explosion. When the fossil record is scrutinized closely, it turns out that the fastest growth in the number of major new animal groups took place during the as yet unnamed second and third stages, generally known as the Tomotian and Attabanian stages, of the early Cambrian, a period of about 13 million years. In that time, the first undoubted fossil annelids, arthropods, brachiopods, echinoderms, mollusks, onychophorans, poriferans, and priapulids show up in rocks all over the world. The driving force behind this explosion was likely a combination of environmental and ecological factors that created what scientists call an evolutionary perfect storm. The reasons for this are still debated, but a leading theory is that the amount of oxygen in the atmosphere had finally reached levels that allowed large, complex animals to exist. Oxygen levels may also have facilitated the metabolics, processes that produce collagen, a protein building block that is the basis for hard structures in the body. Other major changes that occurred in the early Cambrian, 541 to 510 million years ago, include the development of animal species that burrowed into the sediments of the seafloor rather than lying on top of it, and the evolution of the first carbonate reefs, which were built by sponge-like animals called archaeocyathidds. But oxygen alone cannot explain the Cambrian explosion. Equally important was the evolution of predation and the resulting ecological arms race between hunters and hunted. For the first time in Earth's history, organisms evolved that could actively capture and consume other organisms. This created intense selective pressure for defensive adaptations, shells, spines, burrowing behavior, and rapid locomotion. The most visible result of this arms race was the evolution of biomineralization on an unprecedented scale. Organisms began extracting calcium carbonate, calcium phosphate, and silica from seawater to build elaborate shells, exoskeletons, and protective structures. This innovation not only provided defense against predators, but also opened up new possibilities for body architecture, allowing organisms to build larger, more complex structures than had ever been possible with soft tissues alone. First, life exploded with almost all the major groups evolving in a relatively short time, about 40 million years. Second, The rise of animals with hard shells meant they had a much better chance of becoming fossilized. The explosion of life in the Cambrian period is particularly apparent in oceanic fauna, which was without precedent in Earth's history. The Cambrian seas were populated by creatures that seem almost alien to modern eyes, yet they established the basic body plans that would dominate animal life for the next 500 million years. The iconic arthropods of the Cambrian were the trilobites, which left a huge number of fossils. Trilobites had flattened, segmented, plated bodies that helped to protect them in seas that were increasingly filled with predators. With many varieties and sizes, they range from a millimetre to more than 2 feet, 0.6 metres, in length. Trilobites proved among the most successful and enduring of all prehistoric animals. More than 17,000 species are known to have survived until the mega-extinction that ended the Permian period 251 million years ago. The trilobites were remarkable not just for their diversity and longevity, but for their sophisticated sensory systems. Many species had compound eyes with thousands of individual lenses, giving them excellent vision in the underwater world of the Cambrian seas. Some could probably see in colour, detect polarized light, and even perceive depth with remarkable accuracy. This visual sophistication was crucial in a world where predators and prey were locked in an evolutionary arms race. A predator of the Cambrian was the giant shrimp-like Anomalocaris, which trapped its prey in fearsome mouthparts lined with hooks. Even stranger was the five-eyed Orpobinia, which caught its victims using a flexible clawed arm attached to its head. These animals hunted along the seabed, where colonies of archaic sponges grew on organic mineral structures formed by the activity of cyanobacteria. Anomalocaris represents something entirely new in the history of life, a large active predator that could pursue and capture prey with sophisticated hunting behaviours. Growing up to 2 meters in length, it was by far the largest organism of its time, and its presence in Cambrian ecosystems would have fundamentally changed the dynamics of marine life. No longer could organisms simply sit passively and absorb nutrients from their environment. They now had to actively avoid becoming someone else's dinner. The evolutionary response to this predation pressure was swift and dramatic. Organisms evolved an incredible variety of defensive strategies. Some burrowed deep into sediments, others developed thick shells or spiny armour, and still others learned to move quickly across the seafloor or through the water column. Each defensive innovation created new opportunities for predators to evolve counter-strategies, driving a continuous cycle of evolutionary arms races that pushed biological innovation to new heights. However, the Cambrian was nonetheless a time of great evolutionary innovation, with many major groups of organisms appearing within a span of only 40 million years. Trace fossils made by animals also show increased diversity in Cambrian rocks, showing that the animals of the Cambrian were developing new ecological niches and strategies such as active hunting, burrowing deeply into sediment, and making complex branching burrows. Perhaps the most significant innovation of the Cambrian was the evolution of complex nervous systems and sophisticated sensory organs. This was when life learned to see, hear, smell, and taste the world with unprecedented acuity. The compound eyes of trilobites, the photosensitive spots of early vertebrates, and the chemoreceptors of various marine invertebrates all appeared during this remarkable period. The earliest known primitive chordate is Picaia gracilens, a worm-like creature that swam in Middle Cambrian seas. Fossils found in the Burgess Shale of British Columbia show traces of a notochord, a rod-like primitive backbone, a significant step in the evolution of vertebrates. This small, seemingly insignificant organism represents one of the most important evolutionary milestones in Earth's history, the appearance of the lineage that would eventually give rise to all vertebrates, including fish, amphibians, reptiles, birds, mammals, and ultimately humans. The Burgess Shale, a remarkable fossil deposit in the Canadian Rockies, has provided some of our most detailed insights into Cambrian life. The land was barren and subject to erosion. These geologic conditions led to mudslides where sediment periodically rolled into the seas and buried marine organisms. At the Burgess Shale locality in the Canadian Rocky Mountains, sediment was deposited in a deep water basin adjacent to an enormous algal reef with a vertical escarpment several hundred feet high. Though not in a US national park, the type locality of the Burgess Shale, Burgess Pass, is located in British Columbia's Yoho National Park. In order to protect the site, UNESCO designated the Burgess Shale as a World Heritage Site in 1981. The exquisite preservation conditions at the Burgess Shale have given us a unique window into Cambrian ecosystems, revealing not just the hard-shelled organisms that dominate most fossil deposits, but also the soft-bodied creatures that made up the majority of Cambrian life. These fossils show us that the Cambrian seas were inhabited by a bewildering array of organisms, many with body plans that have no modern equivalents. The environmental conditions that enabled the Cambrian explosion were quite different from those of today. During Cambrian time, life was only common in the water. During the Cambrian, land plants had not yet evolved, so the terrestrial world was devoid of vegetation. However, in the oceans, many marine invertebrates, including sponges and brachiopods, lamp shells, were present. The lack of terrestrial vegetation meant that erosion rates were much higher than today, leading to high levels of nutrients in coastal waters that could support abundant marine life. Photosynthesis and primary production were the monopoly of bacteria and algal protists that populated the world's shallow seas. Also during the Cambrian, the oceans became oxygenated. Although there was plentiful atmospheric oxygen by the beginning of the period, it wasn't until the Cambrian that there was a sufficient reduction in the number of oxygen-depleting bacteria to permit higher oxygen levels in the waters. This dissolved oxygen may have triggered the Cambrian explosion, when most of the major groups of animals, especially those with hard shells, first appeared in the fossil record. The rise of complex ecosystems during the Cambrian also marked the beginning of what ecologists call ecological engineering, the process by which organisms modify their environment in ways that affect other species. Life in the shallow regions of the seafloor, however, was already well diversified. This early aquatic ecosystem included the relatively large carnivore Anomalocaris, the deposit-feeding trilobites, early arthropods, and mollusks, the suspension-feeding sponges, various scavenging arthropods, and possibly even parasites such as the Onychophoran Achaea. Thus, it seems likely that a well-developed aquatic ecosystem was already in operation in the ocean shallows by this time. The Cambrian explosion was not just a biological event. It was also a geological and chemical revolution that transformed the Earth's surface. The evolution of burrowing organisms mixed sediments and oxygenated, previously anoxic seafloor environments. The rise of reef-building organisms created new habitats and altered patterns of water circulation. The massive production of calcium carbonate shells and skeletons affected ocean chemistry and the global carbon cycle. The Cambrian explosion by nature is a three-phased explosion of animal body plans alongside episodic biomineralization, pulsed change of generic diversity, body size variation, and progressive increase of ecosystem complexity. The Cambrian was a time of crown groups nested by numbers of stem groups, with a high-rank taxonomy of Linnaean system, classes and above. One of the most intriguing aspects of the Cambrian explosion is what it tells us about the nature of evolutionary innovation. Indeed, statistical analysis shows that the Cambrian explosion was no faster than any of the other radiations in animals' history. However, it does seem that some innovations linked to the explosion, such as resistant armour, only evolved once in the animal lineage. This makes a lengthy Precambrian animal lineage harder to defend. Further, the conventional view that all the phyla arose in the Cambrian is flawed. While the phyla may have diversified in this time period, representatives of the crown groups of many phyla do not appear until much later in the Phanerozoic. This observation highlights an important point. Evolution is not a linear process of steady progress, but rather a complex interplay of innovation, experimentation, and extinction. The Cambrian explosion represents a period when environmental conditions and ecological opportunities aligned to permit rapid evolutionary experimentation. Many of the innovations that appeared during this time would prove to be evolutionary dead ends, while others would form the foundation for all subsequent animal evolution. Recent discoveries have also suggested that the Cambrian explosion may have had a longer fuse than previously thought. Fossil tracks from 545 million years ago suggest complex life forms were already crawling around before the Cambrian explosion began, hinting that evolution's greatest leap may have started much earlier. New fossil evidence suggests the Cambrian explosion, long hailed as the dramatic birth of complex animal life, may not have been the sudden evolutionary event we thought. Researchers analysing ancient trace fossils from 545 million years ago found signs of surprisingly advanced mobile creatures predating the Cambrian by millions of years. These organisms likely had segmented bodies, muscles, and even primitive sensory systems, leaving behind tracks that speak of movement, adaptation, and complexity. This evidence suggests that the foundations of complex animal life were being laid during the final stages of the Proterozoic, and that the Cambrian explosion represents not the sudden appearance of complex life, but rather the point at which complex life became abundant and diverse enough to leave an extensive fossil record. The end of the Cambrian period, around 485 million years ago, was marked by a series of extinctions that eliminated many of the more unusual Cambrian organisms. The end of the Cambrian saw a series of mass extinctions during which many shell-dwelling brachiopods and other animals went extinct. The trilobites also suffered heavy losses. These extinctions cleared the evolutionary stage for new innovations and radiations that would characterize the rest of the Phanerozoic. Following the Cambrian period, the biosphere continued to expand relatively rapidly. In the Ordovician period, 485.4 million to 443.4 million years ago, the classic Paleozoic marine faunas, which included bryozoans, brachiopods, corals, nautiloids, and crinoids, developed. Many marine species died off near the end of the Ordovician because of environmental changes. The Silurian period, 443.4 million to 419.2 million years ago, marks a time when a rapid evolution of many suspension feeders in the oceans occurred. As we reach the end of our journey through Earth's transformation from a hellish wasteland to a cradle of life, it's worth reflecting on the remarkable series of events that made our planet habitable. The story we've traced, from the molten fury of the Hadean through the patient experiments of the Archean, the dramatic upheavals of the Proterozoic, and the explosive creativity of the early Phanerozoic, reveals habitability not as a simple binary state, but as a complex, dynamic process that unfolded over billions of years. What emerges from this deep history is a profound appreciation for the contingent, almost miraculous nature of our existence. At every stage of Earth's early history, our planet balanced on the edge of becoming something radically different. A frozen snowball like early Mars, a scorching greenhouse like Venus, or a world where life never progressed beyond simple microbes. The fact that we are here to contemplate our own origins represents the culmination of billions of years of narrow escapes and fortuitous circumstances. Consider the delicate choreography that was required for Earth to become habitable. Our planet had to form at just the right distance from the sun to allow liquid water to exist. It had to be massive enough to retain an atmosphere, but not so massive as to become a gas giant. It needed a large moon to stabilize its axis and create tides that may have been crucial for the origin of life. It required the right mix of radioactive elements to drive plate tectonics and maintain a magnetic field. Each of these factors alone was necessary but not sufficient. It was their combination that created the unique conditions for habitability. But perhaps even more remarkable than these physical prerequisites was the role that life itself played in creating and maintaining habitable conditions. The Great Oxidation Event shows us that life doesn't simply respond to environmental conditions, it actively shapes them. The cyanobacteria that first learned to split water molecules and release oxygen as a waste product fundamentally altered our planet's atmosphere, oceans, and surface chemistry. Their innovation made possible all subsequent complex life, including us. This insight has profound implications for how we think about habitability, both on Earth and on other worlds. Habitability is not just about having the right physical and chemical conditions, it's about having the right biological conditions as well. A planet might have liquid water, appropriate temperatures, and a suitable atmosphere, but without the right evolutionary innovations and biological feedback systems, it might remain forever trapped in a state of simple, microbial life. The story of Earth's transformation from a hellish wasteland to a cradle of complex life is ultimately a story about time, chance, and the extraordinary creativity of evolution working within the constraints of physics and chemistry. It required not just billions of years, but billions of years filled with exactly the right sequence of innovations, catastrophes, and recoveries. The Great Oxidation Event had to happen, but not too early and not too late. The Snowball Earth episodes had to be severe enough to create evolutionary pressure, but not so severe as to sterilize the planet entirely. The Cambrian explosion had to build on nearly 4 billion years of prior innovations in cellular architecture, energy metabolism, and genetic systems. What emerges from this deep history is a profound appreciation for both the robustness and fragility of life. Life has shown itself to be remarkably resilient, surviving impacts that would make modern nuclear weapons seem like firecrackers, enduring ice ages that covered the entire planet, and adapting to atmospheric compositions that would be instantly lethal to most modern organisms. Yet this same history also reveals how easily things could have gone differently, how a slightly different atmospheric composition, a different orbital configuration, or a different sequence of evolutionary innovations might have led to a very different outcome. As we stand at the threshold of our own potential impact on Earth's future habitability, the deep history of our planet offers both warnings and hope. The warnings are clear. Earth's climate and atmospheric composition are not fixed constants, but dynamic systems that can change rapidly and dramatically. The transitions we've examined, from the methane-rich atmosphere of the Archean to the oxygen-rich atmosphere of today, from the ice-covered world of Snowball Earth to the warm seas of the Cambrian, remind us that Earth's surface conditions have changed dramatically in the past and could do so again. But there is also hope in this history. Life has repeatedly demonstrated its capacity to not only survive catastrophic change, but to turn crisis into opportunity. The organisms that survived the Great Oxidation event didn't just adapt to a world with oxygen, they learned to use it, gaining access to energy sources that made complex multicellular life possible. The life forms that endured the Snowball Earth episodes emerged into a world with new opportunities for diversification and complexity. Even the mass extinctions that punctuated the Phanerozoic cleared the stage for new evolutionary experiments and radiations. Perhaps most importantly, the story of early Earth reminds us that we're not separate from the natural systems that sustain us. We are part of them. Just as cyanobacteria transformed the atmosphere billions of years ago, human activities are transforming it today. Just as the early evolution of complex life depended on the intricate interplay between biological, chemical, and physical systems, our future depends on understanding and working with these same systems. The journey from Hadean hellscape to Cambrian explosion is ultimately our own origin story. Not just the story of how we came to be, but of how the very conditions that make our existence possible came to be. It is a story written in rocks and fossils, in chemical signatures and isotopic ratios, in the patient accumulation of evidence by generations of scientists working to decode Earth's ancient archives. As we face the challenges of the Anthropocene, our own geological age defined by human impact on Earth systems, this deep history offers perspective on both the scale of change that is possible and the resilience of life in the face of transformation. We are participants in Earth's continuing evolution, inheritors of 4 billion years of biological innovation, and stewards of a planet whose habitability is both more robust and more fragile than we might have imagined. The story of Earth's early history is still being written as new discoveries continue to push back the boundaries of what we know about life's origins and early evolution. Each new fossil, each new geochemical analysis, each new insight into the workings of ancient ecosystems adds another piece to the puzzle of how our world became habitable. It is a reminder that science itself is an ongoing exploration, a conversation between present questions and ancient evidence, between human curiosity and deep time. In the end, the transformation of Earth from a molten ball of rock to a living world may be the most remarkable story ever told, not because it was inevitable, but because it was so improbable, so dependent on countless contingencies and narrow escapes. We are the temporary custodians of that remarkable transformation, carrying forward a legacy that began in the primordial darkness of the Hadean and continues to unfold in the uncertain light of our own time.